The scent of old incense and melting wax hung heavy in the air, a familiar perfume of sanctity and tradition that usually brought me a sense of peace. But not today. Today, the air in St. Jude's felt thick with an unspoken tension, a weight that had little to do with reverence and everything to do with the woman standing stiffly beside me. Margaret, my mother-in-law, had a spine forged from iron and a will to match. My son Leo gurgled softly in my arms, his tiny fists batting at the delicate white lace of his baptismal gown. It was a family heirloom, the same one his father Daniel had worn, the same one Margaret had presented to me not as a gift, but as a decree. "He will wear this," she had announced weeks ago, her voice leaving no room for the soft, simple linen outfit I had lovingly chosen. I had relented, as I often did, for the sake of a fragile piece. But as we stood before the ancient stone font, the piece had fractured. The priest, Father Michael, a kind man with eyes that had seen generations of families present their children, smiled warmly. "The parents and godparents, please come forward to the font." I took a breath, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and stepped forward, pulling Daniel with me. My sister Chloe and Daniel's brother Mark, the chosen godparents, followed suit. We were meant to form a small protective circle around Leo, but Margaret moved with us, a shadow I couldn't shake. She positioned herself right beside me, so close her shoulder brushed mine, her gaze fixed on Leo with an unnerving intensity. She wasn't a godparent. Her place was in the front pew, a proud grandmother watching on. "Margaret," Daniel murmured, his voice a low, placating rumble. The priest called for the parents and godparents. Her chin lifted, a gesture of regal defiance I knew all too well. She looked not at her son but at me, her eyes a cool gray. "It's a drafty spot," she said, her voice just loud enough for the four of us to hear. "The baby might catch a chill. I'll stand there instead, to block the air." She gestured vaguely towards the empty space where she thought I should be, further from the font, further from my own son. The implication was clear. She would take my place. My grip on Leo tightened instinctively. A hot surge of anger, sharp and familiar, rose in my throat. All the small surrenders, the bitten-back words, the forced smiles, coalesced into a single point of rebellion. This was my son, my moment. A moment I had dreamed of since the first time I felt his flutter of a kick. Before I could say a word, before Daniel could intervene further, Father Michael's voice echoed, clear and resonant, through the hushed church. He looked at his register, then up at our disjointed group by the font. He smiled, a gentle, knowing expression, but his next words were not what any of us expected. He didn't call for Daniel and me. He didn't ask the godparents to state their intentions. His gaze settled directly and unequivocally on me. "Only Mrs. Eleanor Vance, please," he said, his voice kind but firm. "Just the mother, for now." A collective, silent gasp seemed to ripple through our small group. Daniel looked confused, his hand hovering uncertainly in the air. Chloe and Mark exchanged a wide-eyed glance, but it was Margaret's face I watched. The mask of serene control cracked, just for a second, revealing a flash of pure, unadulterated shock. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, the heavy weight in the air seemed to lift, just a little. The silence that followed Father Michael's request was a vacuum, pulling all the air from our little corner of the church. For a heartbeat, no one moved. We were a frozen tableau of confusion and shock. Daniel's hand, which had been resting on the small of my back, slipped away. He looked from the priest to me, his brow furrowed in a question I couldn't answer. My own feet felt rooted to the spot. Me? Only me? It was a deviation from every baptism I had ever witnessed. Yet the priest's gaze remained on me, calm and expectant. In his eyes, I saw not a challenge, but an invitation, a lifeline. Slowly, I took a step forward, then another, separating myself from the group. The movement broke the spell. I felt Margaret stare like a physical force, boring into my back. I didn't dare turn, but in my mind's eye I saw the fury she would never show in a house of God, a tightening of the jaw, a glacial hardening of her features. She had been publicly overruled, not by me, her declared adversary, but by the unimpeachable authority of the priest himself. She took a single, stiff step backward, retreating into the shadows near the first pew. It was a surrender, but it felt like the coiling of a serpent. As I reached the font, the world seemed to narrow. There was only the gentle sound of Leo's breathing, the ancient, water-worn scent of the stone, and the kind face of Father Michael. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, for my ears only. "Eleanor," he began, his gaze soft as he looked at Leo, who was now awake and staring at the flickering candlelight with wide, curious eyes. I have been doing this for 40 years. I have learned to see the geography of families, the quiet battles, the silent prayers. A mother's heart is the first home a child ever knows. It is a sacred space. This blessing, he gestured to the holy water, is a recognition of a bond that already exists, a bond that you have forged in love and sacrifice. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sudden. He somehow saw the months of quiet struggle, the feeling of being an incubator and then a vessel for someone else's legacy, rather than a mother in my own right. He saw the fight to claim my own son. Before we invite the others, he continued, I want to offer a prayer for you, Eleanor, for your strength, for your courage, for the fierce love you so clearly hold. May you always be his safe harbor. He dipped his thumb into the holy water. Not for Leo, not yet. For me. He gently touched my forehead, the drop of water shockingly cold on my skin. May you be blessed, and may you be a blessing to your child, always. It was a small gesture, one no one else would have noticed or understood, but for me, it was everything. It was an anointing, a coronation. In that quiet moment, I was not just Daniel's wife or Margaret's daughter-in-law. I was Leo's mother, recognized and affirmed in the sight of God and man. A wave of profound, unshakable strength washed over me, displacing the anxiety that had taken root in my heart for so long. Thank you, Father, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. He smiled and then, raising his voice to its normal, cheerful volume, he announced, And now, may we have the father and the godparents join us? Daniel, Chloe, and Mark moved forward, their expressions a mixture of relief and lingering curiosity. Daniel found my hand and squeezed it, his eyes searching mine. I gave him a small, steady smile, a promise that everything was all right. More than all right. As the formal ceremony began, with its beautiful, ancient words washing over us, I held my son. Margaret was watching from the pew, her face a mask of polite indifference. But the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer standing in her shadow. I was standing in the light, and I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in my soul, that I would never let anyone push me into the darkness again. The reception back at our house was, on the surface, a lovely affair. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of our living room, glinting off crystal glasses and silverware. Laughter and conversation created a warm, pleasant hum. But for me, the entire event was viewed through a new lens. It was a stage, and a drama was quietly unfolding just beneath the veneer of celebration. Margaret had been holding court in the center of the room, accepting congratulations from friends and family as if she were the guest of honor. She spoke of Leo's temperament, his resemblance to her side of the family, her plans for his future. She was a general marshaling her troops, rebuilding her territory after the unexpected setback at the church. I watched her from the kitchen, where I was ostensibly checking on the catering, but really, I was just taking a moment to breathe, to hold on to the quiet strength Father Michael had given me. Leo was asleep upstairs, away from the noise, a small monitor clipped to my belt buzzing with the soft static of his breathing. Daniel was circulating, a perfect host, but I noticed his gaze kept flickering towards his mother, then to me, a subtle anxiety in his eyes. He was walking a tightrope, and he knew it. Eventually, the crowd thinned. Daniel was seeing some relatives to the door, and my sister had taken a few friends out onto the patio. The moment I had been anticipating and dreading arrived. Margaret entered the kitchen, her movements deliberate. She began stacking plates with a clatter that was just a little too loud to be accidental. It was quite a performance today, she said, her back to me. The words were clipped, each one a tiny shard of ice. I leaned against the counter, refusing to be drawn into a fight on her terms. It was a beautiful baptism, I replied, my voice even. She turned then, wiping a perfectly clean plate with a cloth. Her eyes met mine. I've never seen a priest do that, to single out one parent. It was very modern, very peculiar. Father Michael is a thoughtful man, I said simply. A humorless smile touched her lips. Thoughtful? Or was he persuaded to be thoughtful? It must have been quite a conversation you had with him beforehand, to arrange such a special moment for yourself, to make sure everyone knew who was in charge. The accusation hung in the air between us, sharp and ugly. The old Eleanor would have shrunk back. She would have stammered a denial, tried to explain, tried to smooth things over. But the woman standing in the kitchen now was different, blessed and affirmed. I stood up straight, letting the silence stretch for a long moment before I spoke. The only thing I arranged with Father Michael was the date and time of my son's baptism, Margaret. What he did at the font came from his own heart and his own wisdom. Perhaps he saw something that needed to be said. The directness of the retort took her by surprise. Her control faltered, and a flicker of raw anger showed in her eyes. And what could he possibly have seen? A devoted grandmother, wanting only the best for her grandson? He saw a mother, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. He saw my son's mother, and he blessed me. I will not apologize for that. Not to you, not to anyone. We stared at each other across the kitchen island. The polite fiction that had governed our relationship for years finally stripped away. This was not about a drafty spot by the font. It was about control. It was about her desperate need to be the matriarch, the primary influence in Leo's life, and my refusal to be relegated to a supporting role in the story of my own family. Just then, Daniel walked back into the kitchen, a cheerful smile on his face that faltered the moment he felt the glacial temperature in the room. "Everything okay?" he asked, his gaze moving between his mother's rigid posture and my calm stance. Margaret turned away, resuming her task with the plates. "Perfectly," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Your wife and I were just discussing the ceremony. So very memorable." She placed a plate onto the stack with a sharp, definitive click. The battle was over, for now. But a line had not just been drawn in the sand. It had been carved in stone. The weeks following the baptism were a study in cold warfare. Margaret did not raise her voice, nor did she ever refer to the incident at the church again. Instead, she employed a different strategy, one of subtle undermining and passive aggression. She would visit bearing extravagant gifts for Leo that overshadowed the simple, age-appropriate toys I had chosen. She would helpfully offer parenting advice in front of Daniel, phrased as gentle suggestions but carrying the weight of condemnation. "Oh, Eleanor, are you sure he's warm enough in that? My boys always had wool, even indoors." Or, "I read a study that says babies need to be stimulated with classical music, not just nursery rhymes." Each comment was a small jab, designed to chip away at my confidence. But the woman who had been blessed at the font was not so easily broken. I found a new well of patience within myself. To her comments, I would offer a polite but firm, "Thank you for the suggestion, Margaret. I'll keep that in mind," before continuing to do exactly what I felt was right for my son. I met her passive aggression not with anger, but with a serene and unshakable resolve. I was the mother. My decisions were final. The dynamic between Daniel and me also began to shift. The tension in our home was palpable, and one evening, after a particularly trying visit from his mother, he finally broke the unspoken silence. We had just put Leo to bed. I was in the living room tidying up the mountain of plastic toys Margaret had left in her wake. Daniel came and stood beside me, watching me put them into a donation box. "You know," he started, his voice hesitant, "you could just leave them out. Leo might like them when he's older." I stopped and looked at him, my expression neutral. "He might, but for now they're overwhelming. He's happy with his wooden blocks and the soft book your sister gave him." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was his tell, the gesture he made when he was wrestling with something internally. "My mom, she means well, Eleanor. She loves him so much." I met his gaze, my heart aching for the difficult position he was in, but unwilling to compromise on the truth. "I know she loves him, Daniel, but this isn't about love. It's about control. She's trying to be his mother, and he already has one." He looked away, staring at the empty fireplace. "The baptism. What happened with Father Michael? Did you talk to him before?" It was the question he'd been afraid to ask. "No," I said softly. "I didn't. He saw what you see every day. He saw that I was being pushed aside. He saw that I was losing my footing. And he gave me a gift, Daniel. He reminded me of my place. Not my place behind your mother, but my place beside my son." The honesty of my words seemed to land with him. He was quiet for a long time, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a weary resignation, but also a new understanding. "I see it," he admitted, his voice low. "I do. I've spent my whole life trying to keep the peace, trying to manage her expectations. I never realized how much of that burden I was asking you to carry. I'm sorry, Eleanor. It stops now. We are a team. You and me." He stepped forward and pulled me into an embrace, his arms wrapping tightly around me. It felt different from any time he had held me before. It wasn't just an embrace of affection, it was an embrace of alliance, of partnership. In that moment, I knew I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. The turning point came a month later. Margaret called, her voice brisk and efficient. "I've taken the liberty of booking a photographer for Leo's 6-month portraits," she announced. "A wonderful man. He did all of Mark's children. He has an opening next Tuesday. I've already paid the deposit." The old Eleanor would have had a knot in her stomach. The old Eleanor would have scrambled to check her calendar, to accommodate, to avoid conflict. But the new Eleanor, bolstered by her husband's support, felt a calm sense of clarity. I took a breath. "That was very generous of you to think of it, Margaret," I said, my voice pleasant. "But Daniel and I have already chosen a photographer. Our appointment is next month. I'll be sure to send you a copy of the prints." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. A silence so profound I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, searching for a response, a countermove. But there was none. I had given her no room to argue. I had been polite, appreciative, and absolutely immovable. "Oh," she said finally, her voice small, deflated. "I see. Well, I suppose I'll have to cancel then." "I suppose you will," I said gently. "But thank you again for the thought." As I hung up the phone, I didn't feel a sense of triumph or glee. I felt a quiet, solidifying peace. I was the mother. I was the one who would choose the photographers, the schools, the path. I was the one who would stand by his side. And if a draft ever came, it would be my shoulder, firm and steady, that would block the chill. Years passed. Not as a raging river, but as a steady, quiet stream. Leo grew from a baby into a bright, boisterous boy with Daniel's easy smile and my thoughtful eyes. Our home was no longer a battleground. It was a home, filled with the delightful chaos of a child's life. Crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, mismatched socks under the sofa, and the sound of laughter echoing in the halls. The armistice with Margaret had settled into a kind of peace. It wasn't the warm, affectionate relationship I had once naively dreamed of, but it was real. It was built on the solid foundation of the boundaries I had so carefully and painfully erected. She was a grandmother, a role she slowly learned to inhabit. She would visit on Sundays, bringing a sensible toy or a book, and she learned to ask, "What is he interested in these days?" before buying. She learned to watch me parent. Her lips sometimes pursed as if holding back a comment, but the comment would remain unspoken. She had tested my resolve a few more times in those early years, but my gentle, unyielding, "No, thank you," became a wall she could not scale. The true evidence of the change came on Leo's 5th birthday. We had a small party in our backyard. The theme was space, and Leo ran around wearing a cardboard helmet, an imaginary astronaut saving the world. Daniel's brother, Mark, was pretending to be an alien, and my sister, Chloe, was handing out planet-themed cupcakes. It was a scene of simple, unadulterated joy. Margaret was there, seated in a patio chair in the shade. I saw her watching as Leo, in a fit of excited running, tripped and fell, scraping his knee on the paving stones. His face crumpled and a wail of pain erupted. Before I could even take a step, I saw Margaret rise slightly from her chair, her grandmotherly instincts kicking in. For a split second, the old dynamic hung in the air, the urge to take charge, to be the one who soothes and fixes. I saw the internal struggle on her face. But then, she settled back into her seat. She watched as I walked calmly to my son, knelt on the grass, and opened my arms. Leo stumbled into my embrace, burying his tear-streaked face in my shoulder. "It hurts, Mommy," he sobbed. "I know it does, sweetheart," I murmured, stroking his hair. "I know. Let's take a look. Oh, that's a brave astronaut's scrape. Nothing we can't patch up. What do you say? A hero's bandage and an extra cupcake?" He sniffled, the tears already subsiding, and nodded. As I lifted him into my arms, my gaze met Margaret's across the lawn. There was no anger in her eyes, no resentment. There was something else, something I had never seen before. A quiet, reluctant acknowledgement, a flicker of respect. In that moment, she wasn't seeing the woman who had defied her. She was seeing her grandson's mother, his safe harbor, and she understood. She finally understood that he had run to me not because she wasn't there, but because I was his home. Later that year, as Christmas approached, we attended the children's pageant at St. Jude's. The church was decorated with fir boughs and red ribbons, smelling of pine and old beloved hymnals. Leo was a shepherd, swathed in a tea towel, and he kept waving at us from the stage. As we sat in the pew, me, Daniel, and this time Margaret sitting peacefully beside me, my mind drifted back to that day 5 years earlier. I looked around at the familiar stone walls, the stained glass windows depicting saints in stoic poses. I remembered the heavy, suffocating weight in the air, the feeling of being an imposter in my own life. I remembered the cold dread and the hot anger. And then I remembered the priest's kind eyes and the shocking, transformative cold of the holy water on my forehead. After the pageant, as we were leaving, I saw a familiar figure by the door, greeting parishioners. It was Father Michael, his hair now completely white, his face etched with a few more lines, but his eyes were the same. On an impulse, I guided my family towards him. "Father Michael," I said. He turned, a gentle smile lighting up his face. "Eleanor, Daniel, and this must be the young man of the house." "This is Leo," I said, placing a hand on my son's shoulder. "He was a very dedicated shepherd tonight." Father Michael chuckled. "I saw. A fine performance." He looked from Leo to me, and for a moment, I wondered if he remembered, if he had any idea of the profound impact of his small, unconventional act all those years ago. But his expression was one of simple, pastoral kindness. He likely saw dozens of families a week, each with their own invisible struggles and triumphs. "It is a joy to watch them grow," he said, his gaze encompassing our small group. "To see a family rooted in love, that is the greatest blessing of all." As we walked out into the crisp winter night, the air sharp and clean, Daniel took my hand. Leo walked between us, holding his father's other hand, chattering excitedly about the pageant. I looked at my family, at this life we had built. A life of peace, not of surrender. A life where I was not an afterthought, but a cornerstone. The stand I had taken that day at the baptism wasn't just about a single moment. It was about every moment that followed. It was the quiet claiming of my own voice, my own strength, my own sacred role. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to know my own worth and to stand firm in my own space, a guardian of my son's heart and a partner to my husband. I had blocked the draft, not just for a moment at a cold stone font, but for a lifetime.